The first step to lesson planning is to identify outcomes, specifically the standard and the skill that the lesson addresses. This video will address two questions: how to identify the primary standard within the lesson, and how to determine the slice or part of the standard in the lesson that's addressed. We'll dig into this first question first. How do I identify the primary standard? We know that many ELA curriculums and lessons list multiple standards that each lesson addresses. Some of these standards are from different strands, such as language, writing, or speaking and listening. They may also list several standards within the RL and RI strands. However, the primary standard is the one that aligns with the literary analysis skill students are learning and practicing. Depending on the curriculum you use, the standards can be found in a number of places. However, you will typically find the standard listed in the lesson or in the unit plan. Here, we see the standards listed in the unit plan for lesson 2. And here, we see the standards as they are included in the lesson plan. This lesson has two standards it ties to: RL.5.1, which is the standard that asks students to support their thinking with evidence, and RL.5.3, which is comparing and contrasting story elements. So, how do we know which one is the primary standard? Well, we can start by looking at what students are doing in the lesson and the practice that the lesson provides. So let's take a look. In the opening of the lesson, there's guidance to review setting and how it influences the plot. You see a screenshot from the lesson right here describing that. Then, in the Building Deeper Meaning section, you can see that students are working with partners to identify and categorize evidence about the setting in order to write sentences to describe the setting. This tells me that the literary analysis skills students are focused on in the lesson has to do with analyzing the setting. So, we know that RL.5.3 is the primary standard because it is the only one of the two that mentions or talks about setting at all. We also know that RL.5.1 or any of the .1 standards are not typically the primary standard because this is the standard that requires students to find evidence from the text. This is something that students are doing in every single lesson regardless of the skill focus. So, now that we know the primary standard is RL.5.3, we can look at how to answer the next question. What slice or part of the standard is being addressed? The RL.5.3 standard encompasses multiple discrete skills. First, it says that students need to be able to compare and contrast story elements, so characters, settings, and story events. We know that in order to do this, they're going to be able to analyze and describe individual elements or individual characters, settings, and story events. We also need to consider what students are going to need to do in order to compare and contrast within this standard. To compare, they're going to have to identify similarities between two things, in this case, characters, settings, or story events. And to contrast, they need to identify differences. Lastly, they're going to need to support all of this with evidence. So here, we can see all of the discrete skills that are encompassed within this RL.5.3 standard. And of them, we need to figure out what is it that students are doing in this lesson. We know from looking at the lesson that students are not being asked to describe or analyze characters or story events. The lesson is focused solely on the setting. We also know that they are not being asked to compare or contrast settings, just to describe the setting of the breadwinner and its impact on the characters and events. That tells us that this lesson is focused on the slice of the standard that is aimed at getting students to be able to compare and contrast settings by first describing and analyzing this individual setting. So that is how we identify the primary standard and the slice or part of the standard that is being addressed in each lesson.